In the technical way in which the term supreme emergencies is used by philosophers working in military ethics, it names situations in which some collective is under a grave threat from another collective, so grave that the threatened collective is allowed to violate the accepted rules of warfare if this is the only way to block the threat. In supreme emergencies, collectives are granted what I elsewhere call special permissions. Permissions to carry out actions which would otherwise, namely in non-emergency situations, be immoral and clearly forbidden. So these are special permissions. In this understanding, the term emergency in general, and in our field too, is a normative one. When people say, hey, this is an emergency, they mean that, of course they mean some facts about the case, but they also mean that in this emergency we are allowed to, or maybe we ought to do such and such. In two papers I published several years ago, I expressed some sympathy for this doctrine, but was skeptical as to whether moral philosophy was equipped to explain it. One point that especially bothered me was what I shall call the continuum thesis, which is the following. There's a continuum between non-emergency, emergency, and supreme emergency situations, hence special permissions apply all along the continuum. If this thesis is accepted, and if special permissions are granted in supreme emergencies, they should apply mutatis mutandis to less extreme cases too. For instance, if to save itself from being murdered on a very large scale, a collective is allowed to kill thousands of non-combatants on the aggressive side, then surely to save itself from a less murderous attack, a collective should be allowed to kill several hundreds of non-combatants, and so on. The point is that the same reasons, be they utilitarian, deontological, or other, that might justify massive indiscriminate killing in supreme emergencies seem to justify some measure of indiscriminate killing in less radical situations too. The continuum thesis embodies the proportion thesis, which is the following. If collectives have a special permission to carry out an otherwise immoral action A in the face of a very grave threat T, then they have a similar permission to carry out an otherwise immoral action A tag in the face of a weaker threat T tag, such that T divided by A equals T tag divided by A tag. If the continuum thesis is true, it seems to erode the fundamental principles of jus in bello, namely the immunity of non-combatants. It also undermines the separation thesis, according to which jus in bello is separate from jus ad bellum. If the continuum thesis is accepted, then the worse the objectives of war for the attacked collective, the wider the permissions granted to the collective to protect itself. These implications of the continuum thesis explain the ongoing philosophical interest in the morality of supreme emergencies. I mean, we are having 3 papers on this topic in this conference, which maybe says something. Fully fledged supreme emergencies are obviously quite rare. I mean, we found it hard yesterday to find examples. But if the continuum thesis is true, they have implications for far more common situations. They encourage the thought that the morality of war is not deep, to borrow Jeff McMahon's expression, that is not grounded in deep, valid moral distinctions, which means that there's no moral reason to stick to the war convention if the price of doing so would be to lose the war or suffer some other painful fate. But this means that the moral aspirations of the war convention are a sham. Collectives can be expected to stick to them only insofar as they can reasonably hope to gain by doing so. When such hope becomes unreasonable, when keeping the rules of engagement demands a significant toll, the rules are thrown to the wind, or at least suspended, in a way that leaves the threatened collective wide leeway to select the means to defend itself. This is what I shall call the disturbing thought, which is the suspicion that the war convention is nice to have, but has no firm and binding moral grounding. Thus, one reason for the interest in supreme emergencies is their challenge to the fundamentals of just war theory. A second and more recent reason is the assumed connection between supreme emergencies and terrorism. Since what characterizes terrorism is its blatant disregard for the war convention, it is tempting to think that the way to justify terrorism, if one exists, is by arguing that terrorism is a response to situations of supreme emergency, situations in which such disregard is justified. Since the war against terrorism often requires a breach of the rules of warfare too, the idea of supreme emergencies is recruited in that context as well, in order to justify the otherwise immoral and illegal measures used against such organizations. The main goal of my paper today is to discuss the challenge posed by just war theory by the continuum thesis. Towards the end of the paper, I shall make a few comments to connect this discussion to the notion of asymmetric wars. How then could supporters of special permissions halt the sliding down on the continuum from supreme emergencies to much less radical situations? One answer would be that the difference in magnitude between threats that create supreme emergencies and other kinds of threat that characterize conflicts in the international level is so great that it creates a difference in quality between them. Let me call this the quantity makes quality argument. Okay, so here's the argument. The difference in magnitude between the threat that creates a supreme emergency and other kinds of threat that characterize conflicts on the international arena is so big that it makes a difference in quality between them. When the difference between kinds of threat becomes one of quality, so the argument assumes, it is no longer possible to move from the permission to do A in the face of T to the permission to do A divided into 2 in the face of T divided to 2, thereby denying the proportion thesis. To illustrate the idea in more concrete terms, since the evil of genocide is qualitatively worse than the sum of the evils of killing each of the individual members of some ethnic or religious group, it is not the case that if, to prevent a genocide, the group under threat is allowed to kill n innocent people of the attacking group, then to prevent a tenth of a genocide, so to speak, it is allowed to kill n divided into 10 innocent people of the attacking group. If this argument is sound, then the continuum thesis is refuted, and the threat to the fundamental principles of jus in bello safely removed. But is the argument sound? I suspect that even if we accept that the magnitude of the evil makes a difference, it does not make such a difference as supporters of the present solution would like us to believe. To take the example of massacre, even if the massacre of n divided into 2 people of some collective is not as evil as half the evil involved in the massacre of n people of the collective, it is still awful enough, which makes it hard to believe that in C divided to 2, no otherwise immoral action would be permitted. Accordingly, one could formulate a modified version of the proportion thesis, which would run as follows. We're just adding quality to the proportion thesis. If collectives have a special permission to carry out an otherwise immoral action A in very threatening circumstances C, then they have a similar permission to carry out an otherwise immoral action A tag in less threatening circumstances C tag in proportion to the magnitude and quality of the threat posed by them. That would still give them significant leeway to use otherwise immoral measures. Thus, instead of, this says, if it is the case that in circumstances C, it is permitted to carry out A, which again is an otherwise immoral action, then it is the case that in circumstances C divided to 2, that is kind of the half of the threat, it would be permitted to do half of the immoral action. That was the original proportion thesis. Instead of that, we get a weaker thesis, which is nevertheless threatening enough to just war theory, which says if it is the case that in circumstances C it is permitted to do A, then in half of C it's permitted to do a third of A. While the modified proportion thesis would be less devastating to just war theory than the unmodified one, it would still be devastating enough, as it would still allow the intentional killing of innocents in circumstances in which such killing would evidently be ruled out by just war theory. I turn now to the most advanced attempt to solve the continuum problem, developed recently by no other than Itzik Ben-Baji. I mean, Itzik and myself talked a lot about this in Jerusalem, so we said, why not do the same thing here? And maybe we can make some progress. As I read Itzik's solution, it comprises two major moves. The first seeks to explain how killing the innocent in supreme emergencies might at all be permissible. The second seeks to explain how this permission can be prevented from spilling over to less desperate situations, i.e., how the continuum thesis can be rejected. Let me take these two moves in turn. In supreme emergencies, the threatened collective is allowed to kill many innocent members of the aggressive side. Moreover, it is allowed to take more innocent lives on the aggressor side than those that would thereby be saved on its own side. How could this mass killing of the innocent be morally justified? To answer this question, Ben-Baji utilizes a distinctive form of consequentialism developed by Sen, namely rights consequentialism. According to this theory, the morality of our actions derives from their consequences, but these include not only states of affairs, but also rights violations. Assume, for example, that one of those asteroids that philosophers like so much is about to kill 100 innocent people unless I push 100 other innocent people, which philosophers always happen to have around them, in its track in order to block it. Although the end result would be just as bad in both scenarios, namely 100 innocents being killed, my action would involve also a violation of rights, hence would be morally worse. I think this came up yesterday in one of the talks. Furthermore, once we factor in the rights violations, I would be prohibited from blocking the asteroid even by killing fewer than 100 innocent people. The feature of rights violations enhances the moral evil of acts which are already forbidden. The exact degree of enhancement is impossible to determine, though I would guess it is somewhere around 50%, because Ben-Baji says that, I quote, an outcome that contains harm involving rights violations is much worse than outcomes containing the same amount of harm but no rights violation. On this view, other things being equal, a state of affairs in which 100 innocent people are killed by an asteroid is better than a state of affairs in which, say, 140 people are murdered by human agency. The account seems of little help in understanding supreme emergencies, because in supreme emergencies there are severe rights violations or contemplated violations on both sides. The attacked collective violates the rights of the innocent on the aggressor side in order to prevent violations of the rights of innocents on its own side. how then might the attacked group kill more innocents on the enemy side than those it hopes to save on its own side? In reply to this question, Benbaji proposes that rights violations come in degree. And in calculating the degree, we must take into consideration not only the number of individuals whose rights are violated, but the level of disrespect and dehumanization expressed by them. Although all rights violations express disrespect towards their victims, the disrespect expressed by intentional murder, for example, is more severe than that expressed in reckless killing. Thus, other things being equal, it would be worse if 100 people, and probably even 70 people, are intentionally killed than if 100 people are recklessly killed. Supreme emergencies are situations in which the aggressive side poses a threat of massacre or enslavement on the other side. Massacre is not simply mass killing. It's not just killing a lot of people. It is killing driven by a denial of the victim's humanity. It therefore represents radical evil, an extreme case of dehumanization. Since defensive killing aimed at preventing such radical evil is not in itself radical, as its agents do not deny the humanity of their victims, such killing, evil as it might be, is less evil than the killing intended by the aggressor. And this means that the option of killing more innocent people on the aggressive side than those saved on the attacked side might be the lesser evil, hence morally permitted. This, finally, explains how in supreme emergencies, a small but decent collective might be permitted to kill many thousands of innocent people in the great but evil collective that threatens it, even if the number of innocents that would be saved by such a defensive act is smaller than those killed. In Benbaji's view, then, the rationale for special permissions is not self-defense, but consequentialism properly understood. I shall comment briefly on one aspect of this view and then move to the second part of Benbaji's account, i.e. his rejection of the continuum thesis. Do you know what? Maybe I'll skip this. You should say yes, Kiris. Okay. So this might come up in discussion. I'll just skip to the continuum thesis, which is the focus of my paper. Okay. So I turn now to the way in which Benbaji's contractarian interpretation of the morality of war is supposed to solve the continuum problem. So this is the contractarian account of war. Itzik, you'll get less time, you know. You realize that, because I'm doing the work for you. Okay. States have a mutually advantageous interest to prefer a rule-governed war over total unlimited war. Hence, the rules of war are binding regardless of questions about the justness of the war. However, when defeat in a rule-governed war would result in massacre or enslavement, then ex ante, states don't have such a preference. Hence, they are not subject to the constraints imposed by the War Convention. Okay, let me skip this. Okay, so in case of the price of keeping the War Convention would be defeat resulting in dehumanization, enslavement, and so on, those various circumstances that fall under the heading of supreme emergencies, then, as I said, the constraints don't hold. One way to describe what happens in supreme emergencies is to say that in these situations, the War Convention breaks down with all the rights and duties embodied in it, which explains how states might have special permissions to do things that would be otherwise forbidden. A different way of describing the situation within the contractarian framework, which Benbaji seems to prefer, would be to say that the war contract itself includes a clause about supreme emergencies, to the effect that in such circumstances, the threatened party is granted special permissions to prevent the catastrophe that might befall it. We can now see how the contractarian view tries to avoid the problem emerging from the continuum thesis. In regular, non-emergency situations, states would prefer a rule-governed war even if it carried the risk of defeat. Just as teenagers would prefer rule-governed fights. Boxes yes, knives no, kicks yes, broken bottles no, even if it meant that in some fights they would be defeated. On balance, such ex-ante mutual self-restriction would be the best arrangement for both sides. However, in supreme emergency situations, the assumed advantage from the war convention would be offset by the prospect of massacre and enslavement. Hence, in such situations, and only in such situations, the war convention breaks down and special permissions become available. The crux of the solution to the problem raised by the continuum thesis is then that while states would not commit themselves ex ante to an arrangement that might doom them to massacre and enslavement, they would commit themselves to rules that carried lighter risks to themselves in order to enjoy the advantages of such rules in terms of minimizing the harm inflicting on civilians. While it is in the interest of states to subject themselves on the basis of mutuality to the rules of war, even at the risk of having to pay a price for doing so, it is not in their interest to subject themselves to such rules if the price of doing so is too high, that is massacre and enslavement. So I think this is quite a tempting solution. For the sake of argument, let us accept the contractarian account. Does it succeed in blocking the continuum between supreme emergencies and other less desperate situations? For this to work, one must assume that only in face of grim prospects such as massacre and enslavement does the war convention break down, not in face of other risks, grim as these might be. In particular, states would prefer rule-governed wars over total wars, even if the price of adhering to such rules would be defeat in war, provided that the defeat did not carry the risk of radical dehumanization. However, I doubt whether this captures accurately the interests of states. It seems to me that when the very existence of states is in danger, they would prefer a regime with no rules if they estimate that such a regime might improve their chances of protecting themselves over other regimes. Or to put it in contractarian terms, states would prefer total war over rule-governed war in cases where their very existence is under threat. Interestingly enough, Itzig seems to be sympathetic to this suggestion, though his official definition of supreme emergencies refers to the threat of, I quote, dehumanization, enslavement, and/or systematic murder, and/or ethnic cleansing of the community in question. He also mentions less radical threats, such as, I quote again, circumstances in which the very existence of the just state and the way of life of the communities that this state protects are seriously threatened. But this last definition would carry the implication that any defeat resulting in the loss of sovereignty would be a case of supreme emergency, even if it did not lead to systematic murder, enslavement, and so on. One of the main questions recently debated in just war theory concerns the moral legitimacy of ordinary national defensive wars. Such thinkers, notably David Rodin, where's David?
We don't know.
We don't know. Okay. Doubt whether the threat of losing political sovereignty is enough to justify going to war, even if the war contemplated is fought in full accordance with the war convention. when I say that David doubts this is kind of an understatement. Actually, his entire book aims at showing that it doesn't, that the very protection of political communities is not sufficient to justify going to war. And then the last few pages of his book, he tries, nevertheless, somehow, to defend going to war. Against this background, I mean, the debate around Rodin's thesis, one can see how radical the above conclusion is. While Rodin forbids, or at least is close to forbidding, the employment of even ordinary measures of warfare in order to defend the political community, Benbaji seems to permit the employment of extreme measures, including mass killing of the innocent, if necessary to protect the very existence of the just state and the way of life of the communities that this state protects. But this brings me back to the worry I expressed at the beginning of my paper in the guise of the disturbing thought. Once the idea of supreme emergency is admitted, states seem to be subject to the rules of war only insofar as doing so does not jeopardize their chances of victory, in which case they might shift gears and violate them, which seems to imply that the constraints imposed by the rules of warfare are weak and superficial. In the final analysis, the contractarian account of the morality of war seems to get too close to the realist position, by which I mean the view that morality is valuable on the international level too, even in war, so long as it does not prevent states from advancing their interests in general and from winning their wars in particular. A natural response to this criticism would be to adopt a stricter approach with regard to the conditions that constitute supreme emergencies, and argue that only when defeat is assumed to end in mass murder or enslavement are special permissions granted, and not in cases of plain defeat which do not carry such a prospect. The problem with this move, however, is that it seems to misrepresent the interests of states, or again, to use contractarian terms, it seems to misconceive the kind of contract that states would ex ante agree to. States would not consent to an agreement that would deprive them from the last measures available to them to defend their very existence as separate political entities. And I think the reason they would not accept such an agreement is the following. Their interest in not losing their sovereignty is stronger than their interest in conquering other states and ending their sovereignty. They would prefer an agreement that granted them special permissions to protect their very existence, even at the price of granting such permissions to all states, which would make it harder for them to take over other states, if they so willed. Hence, the contractarian account seems committed to extending the notion of supreme emergencies to cases of what I call plain defeat as well, which A, is very hard to swallow, and B, hard to justify within the framework of the prevailing moral theories. This problem notwithstanding, contractarianism does seem to solve the continuing problem at least, because it manages to explain how come states are granted special permissions only in the face of grave threats, but not in the face of non-emergency situations, namely in regular circumstances of warfare. In such circumstances, when there is no immediate threat of defeat, the war convention is assumingly fully valid with the constraints it poses on the targeting of innocents. Yet I'm not sure that even this can be granted. In my last paragraph, for the first time, I inserted the term immediate to characterize the kind of threat regarding which states might be granted special permissions, suggesting that when the threat is not immediate, namely in regular warfare circumstances, such permissions are not available. But why should immediacy carry any intrinsic moral importance in the present context? After all, the justification for launching war in the first place is self-defense. which in classical national defense wars means the right of states to protect their sovereignty against those who threaten it. States go to war in order to protect themselves from defeat resulting in loss of sovereignty. But if that's the case, it is hard to see why the permitted measures for this protection should not apply from the first day of war. If the protection of sovereignty is so valuable that it justifies special permissions, and if the very justification for war is the protection of sovereignty, then special permissions seem to be valid from the very beginning, which means the collapse of the traditional distinctions that constitute the ethics of war. Before concluding, let me connect this discussion of supreme emergencies to the notion of asymmetric wars, which is, after all, the topic of this conference. Some assume that what is crucial to such wars is a radical disproportion between the military forces of the subjects engaged in the conflict. But if that's the meaning of the expression, then many wars in the past were asymmetric too, such as the war of Nazi Germany against Luxembourg, the war of the Roman Empire against the Jewish rebellion in Palestine, and so on, while the term asymmetric wars is used to characterize new wars. Moreover, if supreme emergencies indeed include threats to the very existence of political communities, then on this understanding, asymmetric wars would almost by definition be supreme emergencies, because these are situations in which, due to its military inferiority, one party to the war is doomed to lose unless it allows itself measures which are usually forbidden. Yet I doubt whether those using this definition have such an implication in mind. According to a different understanding of asymmetric wars, what is special about them is that they are not wars carried out on the battlefield between armies. In these wars, while one side, a state, has a regular army and employs it more or less according to the conventions of war, the other side has no such army and instead utilizes a combination of guerrilla fighting and terror attacks with no regard or only minimal regard for the conventions of war and for international law. Thus, referring to a war as asymmetric says nothing about which side in the final analysis is more powerful and with a better chance of prevailing. Within this understanding, both sides in asymmetric wars would be granted special permissions, or could be granted special permissions. The state could help itself to special permissions if the threat posed to it is grave enough and if there's no other way of countering it. In contemporary asymmetric wars, the threat will hardly ever be the loss of sovereignty, for the simple reason that the non-state agent has no army to actually conquer the relevant territory. Rather, the threat would typically be one of mass murder and of the drastic obstruction of normal life brought about by indiscriminate attacks on residential areas using rockets, bombs, and what have you. Thus, from the point of view of the states involved in asymmetrical wars, such wars often create supreme emergencies for them. As for the other side of the conflict, i.e. the non-state agent, the threat it faces is typically oppression in various degrees and denial of the right to sovereignty. Whether we should regard such threats or such wrongs as constituting supreme emergencies depends to a great extent on the correctness of the continuing thesis. Does the non-state group have to face a threat of massacre and enslavement to be granted special permissions, or could lighter threats be sufficient? Should enslavement be understood in a strict and almost literal manner, or could it be taken to include all kinds of oppression and domination in varying degrees? you can immediately see how a permissive answer to these questions relies on something like the continuum thesis and opens the door for the problematic implications mentioned above. Okay. So I'll conclude. Some believe that if the only way for individuals to defend themselves from a serious attack is to directly kill innocents who bear no moral or causal responsibility for the attack, then the former are doomed, for they have no permission to do so. The same would be said about states, i.e., if the only way a state has to defend oneself from a grave threat is to directly kill innocents who bear no moral or causal responsibility for the attack, the state has no permission to do so and it's doomed. Others, most people I estimate, would say that at least with regard to states, I don't think, or I haven't heard people making the same arguments regarding individuals, which is kind of interesting. But at least with regard to states, they are granted special permissions to defend themselves in cases of emergency. However, such permissions give rise to the continuing problem and to the disturbing thought. They raise the suspicion that the War Convention rests on a shaky basis. I discussed two solutions to this problem: the quality makes quantity solution and the contractarian one. The latter seems to me much more promising, though at the end of the day I'm not sure that it works. Although contractarianism establishes a distinction between supreme emergencies and less dramatic situations, the price of accepting this distinction means conceding that the category of supreme emergencies includes all or most cases of defeat in national defense wars, even cases that do not result in massacre and enslavement. Moreover, it seems committed to the view that if special permissions are granted, they can be granted from the first day of war. These results are, of course, bothersome and give rise to the disturbing thought, which has not yet been removed. Does the War Convention rest on firm moral ground, or is it to be held only so long as the price of doing so is not too high, in which case it might be jettisoned? That is the question I'd like to put on the table for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.